Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into one of history's most intriguing and, dare I say, unsettling topics: the effects of inbreeding among royal families in medieval times. Picture it, a cold, dark castle, candlelight flickering on, ancient stone walls, as royal bloodlines are passed down with one terrifying goal in mind: to preserve power, wealth, and lineage. But at what cost? Imagine growing up in a world where the very people you trust to protect your legacy are part of a genetic web so tangled it's practically begging for trouble. You probably won't survive this well. Your genes definitely won't. And you thought the family reunion drama was bad till so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do. Here, let me know where you're from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these tales of medieval madness stretch. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, let's begin with a look at the royal families of the medieval world who believed the preservation of their bloodlines through inbreeding was essential to maintaining their power. Over time, however, this practice led to an eerie combination of health problems, physical deformities, and even mental instability. And, oh boy, did the women in these families face some of the worst consequences. The term inbreeding might sound modern, but the practice has been around for centuries, and it was especially common in the royal circles where lineage was everything. The problem was that these royal families, often linked by blood ties across multiple nations, believed their pure bloodlines made them superior. To keep their families pure, or, more accurately, to avoid losing power to outsiders, they often married within their own families. No outsiders allowed, just cousins, uncles, aunts, and siblings. It sounds almost comical now, doesn't it? But back then, this practice was taken deadly seriously. Royal families were obsessed with keeping their bloodlines as close-knit as possible, and the resulting genetic defects were often ignored or hidden away behind closed doors. It's almost as if they thought that being royal made them invincible to biology's little quirks. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Historians still argue whether these inbreeding practices were primarily motivated by political strategy, or whether the royal families genuinely believed in the sanctity of blood purity. Either way, the effects were devastating. Now, let's start with one of the most infamous examples of this kind of royal disaster: the Habsburg dynasty. Picture this: towering figures, noble names, but behind all that grandeur was an ever-growing list of genetic issues. The Habsburgs didn't just marry within their own family, they took it to an art form. A very dangerous art form. By the time the Habsburg family reached its peak in the 16th century, the bloodline had become so intermarried that they were known for certain distinctive traits, like a prominent chin, which became the hallmark of the family. But it wasn't just about chins. There were also reports of physical deformities, including crossed eyes, facial asymmetry, and poor health. Historians speculate that the inbreeding led to severe genetic disorders that affected not only the body but also the mind. Take King Charles II of Spain, for example. Charles was a product of multiple generations of intermarriage, and the results were disastrous. He had trouble walking, eating, and even speaking. It was said that he had the mental age of a young child, and the royal family believed this was the result of too many generations of cousin marriages. Some even blamed his inability to produce an heir on the severe genetic disorders he inherited from his family's constant intermarrying. historians still argue whether Charles II's mental and physical issues were purely the result of inbreeding, or whether they were exacerbated by other factors, such as the stress of royal expectations. One thing is certain, though: his reign marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain, partly due to the catastrophic health effects of the inbreeding. But the Habsburgs were not alone in this peculiar practice. There were other royal families that, for all their wealth and power, experienced similar genetic issues due to their obsession with keeping the bloodline intact. And while many of these stories are shrouded in mystery and secrecy, one of the most tragic tales involves Queen Juana of Castile, known in history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Juana's life was a tumultuous one, filled with sorrow and drama that even Hollywood would struggle to replicate. Juana's mental instability has been attributed to several factors, but it's widely believed that the constant inbreeding within her royal bloodline played a significant role. Her family history is riddled with political machinations, love triangles, and what can only be described as a deadly mix of genetics and politics. Juana's own father, King Ferdinand, and her mother, Queen Isabella, both came from intermarried royal lines, and it's possible that this passed on certain genetic issues to their daughter. Historians are still divided on whether Juana's infamous bouts of madness were due solely to the effects of her family's genetic troubles, or whether they were the result of personal loss and the immense pressures of royal life. Some argue that she was simply a victim of her time. Women in medieval history were often labeled mad for reasons as trivial as showing strong emotions. Others point to the undeniable genetic legacy of inbreeding that plagued her family. But whether it was genetics, politics, or something else entirely, Juana's story is a tragic reminder of how the obsession with bloodlines and family purity came with devastating consequences. Her mental instability and tragic life have cemented her place in history, though historians still argue about whether she was truly mad or simply a woman struggling under the weight of her circumstances. And it wasn't just the Habsburgs or the Spanish royal family. In medieval Europe, many royal houses were entangled in similar genetic webs. For instance, the Medici family, renowned for their wealth and influence, was no stranger to intermarriage. While they may not have had the same genetic consequences as the Habsburgs, the Medici family certainly experienced their own share of oddities and health issues. Their bloodline was filled with some curious cases, though some of the more bizarre stories might have been exaggerated over time. Yet, it's widely acknowledged that they, too, were part of the same genetic drama. Historians still argue whether the Medici's focus on maintaining power through intermarriage contributed to their family's eventual downfall. While the Medici were wealthy and influential, their bloodline began to show signs of strain. Just like the other royal families that adhered to the pure bloodline ideal, these inbreeding practices also led to an unhealthy obsession with preserving royal families. Rather than marrying outside of their circles, they instead focused on ensuring their dynasties remained intact, resulting in problems that would haunt them for generations. And this brings us to a broader point. Why did these royal families, despite being so powerful, make such reckless decisions with their own bloodlines? Historians still argue over whether the royals genuinely thought inbreeding would preserve their power, or whether they were simply ignorant of the dangers. Perhaps, as we look back, it's hard not to see the tragic irony these dynasties fell apart not because they lacked wealth or power, but because they were so obsessed with holding on to those very things. They forgot the most basic law of nature: genetics don't lie. Now that we've touched on the basics of royal inbreeding, let's delve deeper into one of the most well-known, yet devastatingly misunderstood, consequences of this practice: the Habsburg dynasty. If you've ever heard the term Habsburg, or seen images of the famous Habsburg family with their distinctive protruding chins, you might already know that this family's genetic issues were as legendary as their power. The Habsburg family was known for its remarkable ability to maintain control over much of Europe during the Renaissance and early modern periods. However, this very control came at a price. To maintain their royal bloodline, the Habsburgs engaged in what can only be described as a staggering amount of inbreeding. Over the course of many generations, the family engaged in numerous intermarriages with close relatives, cousins, uncles, nieces, you name it. They were obsessed with preserving their pure bloodline, which, as we've come to see, did not work out as intended. The most infamous example of the Habsburgs' inbreeding is King Charles II of Spain. By the time Charles took the throne, the Habsburg bloodline had become so incredibly inbred that the genetic consequences were painfully obvious. Not only did Charles have the signature Habsburg jaw, but he also exhibited numerous physical and mental health issues that historians and scientists now attribute to the family's relentless inbreeding. Charles struggled with learning disabilities, extreme physical deformities, and fertility issues. It is often said that he was unable to walk until the age of 8, and that he was mentally incapable of ruling for much of his reign. Despite being a king, Charles couldn't even speak clearly until much later in life. A consequence of his severely impaired cognitive function, historians still argue whether Charles II's condition was purely the result of inbreeding, or whether the political pressures of the time and his tumultuous life played a role. However, it's hard to ignore the fact that Charles II's death marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. In fact, he left no heir, which led to a major political crisis. The death of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain is often seen as the direct result of generations of inbreeding, and it's one of the most tragic stories in royal history. But the story doesn't end there. The Habsburgs, as a family, continued to suffer from the effects of their bloodline for generations. For example, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination triggered World War I, also belonged to the Habsburg family. Though he wasn't directly impacted by the same inbreeding issues as Charles II, he did bear the burden of the family's notorious genetic legacy. As we move through history, it becomes clear that the Habsburgs were a family whose power was severely undermined by their own obsession with maintaining their bloodline through inbreeding. Now, let's look at the broader picture. The Habsburgs are far from the only royal family to have struggled with the effects of inbreeding. Take, for example, the Spanish Habsburgs. While the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family were linked by marriage, they often seemed to suffer from their own brand of inbreeding-related issues. One of the most notable Spanish Habsburgs was King Philip II. Like many other Habsburgs, Philip married his relatives in an effort to maintain the family's European dominance. This included his marriage to his niece, Princess Anna of Spain. While Philip was not as physically or mentally debilitated as Charles II, the practice of inbreeding led to a weakening of the family's gene pool over time. Historians still argue whether these marriages were genuinely necessary for political reasons, or whether they were simply a result of the royal obsession with keeping the bloodline pure. Some believe that these royal unions were more about ensuring that the crown remained in the family than about true love or even practicality. Whatever the reason, the long-term consequences for the family were undeniable. Over generations, the repeated pattern of intermarriage left the Spanish Habsburgs with a weak and vulnerable bloodline, which ultimately contributed to their decline. As we continue to explore the consequences of inbreeding among royal families, let's move away from the Habsburgs for a moment and take a look at another family, the Plantagenets. This powerful family ruled England for over 3 centuries, and yet their genetic history is just as tangled as that of the Habsburgs. The Plantagenets are a fascinating case because, while they didn't practice inbreeding to the same extreme degree as the Habsburgs, their bloodline still suffered from the effects of intermarriage, the most well-known example of genetic issues. Among the Plantagenets is King Richard III. Richard III's family had a long history of intermarriage, but by the time Richard came to the throne, the physical effects of the family's close-knit bloodline were hard to ignore. Richard was often depicted as a hunchback, which many historians now believe was a result of the genetic complications caused by the frequent intermarriages within his family. In recent years, scientists have even gone so far as to use DNA testing to examine Richard III's remains, in an attempt to better understand the genetic issues that may have plagued the Plantagenets. The results were fascinating. It turns out that Richard III likely suffered from scoliosis, a condition that affects the curvature of the spine, and this may have been exacerbated by the genetic issues in his family line. Historians still argue whether Richard's scoliosis was purely the result of genetic issues, or whether other factors, such as his traumatic childhood and the stress of royal life, contributed to his condition. Regardless, it's clear that the Plantagenet family's tendency to intermarry played a role in the physical and mental conditions that plagued its members. But the Plantagenets weren't the only royal family to face genetic challenges. Take the House of Valois, for example. This French dynasty ruled over France for several centuries, and while they were not as extreme in their inbreeding practices as the Habsburgs or the Spanish Habsburgs, they still suffered from the consequences of their royal marriages. In fact, the Valois family had its own share of genetic defects, including instances of infertility, mental instability, and physical deformities. Historians still argue whether the issues within the House of Valois were due to inbreeding, or whether other factors, such as the political instability and constant warfare during the period, played a role in the family's struggles. One thing is certain, though: the royal bloodlines were often so tightly interwoven that it was nearly impossible to separate the effects of inbreeding from other factors. The obsession with blood purity didn't just stop with the Habsburgs or the Plantagenets, it stretched far beyond that. And as we move further into the tangled web of royal families, it becomes clear that inbreeding was more than just a practice. It was a royal downfall that, in many cases, led to the eventual extinction of one's great dynasties. As we continue to explore the dark history of royal inbreeding, let's turn our attention to one of the most tragic, yet fascinating, stories in European history. Queen Juana of Castile, famously known as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Her tale is a stark reminder of how deeply inbreeding can affect not only the body but the mind as well. Juana's life is full of drama, mystery, and more than a little bit of heartbreak, and it provides a chilling example of how genetic issues can manifest in the highest echelons of society. Juana was born into the powerful house of Trastamara, a royal family that was no stranger to inbreeding. Her parents, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, were cousins, and while their marriage was politically motivated, it was also an example of the royal tradition of keeping bloodlines pure. Unfortunately for Juana, the impact of this practice would become painfully apparent as she grew older. From the very beginning of her life, Juana was set on a path filled with turmoil. After her mother's death, Juana's father, Ferdinand, seized control of the Castilian crown, sidelining her at every opportunity. But the real tragedy of Juana's life began with her marriage to Philip, the handsome Duke of Burgundy, a marriage that would forever intertwine her fate with that of her husband. Philip was handsome, yes, but his marriage to Juana was full of political maneuvering, and it's in this relationship that we begin to see the deep psychological effects of inbreeding on Juana. Historians still argue whether Juana's mental instability was a result of her family's inbreeding, or whether it was exacerbated by her tumultuous marriage to Philip. Some argue that her emotional distress came from the betrayal and neglect she experienced at the hands of her husband. Others believe that the genetic repercussions of her royal bloodline had already begun to take their toll. In any case, her mental state became a focal point of historical attention, leading to her being labeled as mad by those around her. Despite the fact that her symptoms, severe depression, extreme anxiety, and violent outbursts might be considered normal for someone in her position, the historical narrative branded her as insane. Juana's downward spiral deepened when she became convinced that her husband, Philip, had been unfaithful. She became obsessed with his death, and when he passed away unexpectedly in 1506, she refused to leave his coffin for over 3 days, seemingly in denial of his death. Historians still debate whether Juana was genuinely mentally ill, or simply reacting to the immense pressures and tragedies of her life. It is important to note that inbreeding is often linked to genetic disorders that can lead to cognitive issues, and Juana's story is a classic case of how genetics can have lasting consequences. While it's difficult to say with certainty whether her madness was caused by inbreeding or her personal experiences, one thing is clear: her life and reign were marred by emotional instability, which may have been influenced by her family's genetic history. But Juana's life isn't just a cautionary tale of inbreeding gone wrong. She also represents a larger historical trend in medieval Europe, where women in royal families were often subjected to immense pressure to marry and produce heirs, often to relatives. The physical and psychological effects of this practice would ripple through generations, leaving a legacy of health issues, both mental and physical. For many noble families, while Juana's case was extreme, it wasn't the only one. In fact, many royal women were subjected to the same kind of genetic strain. For example, Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II of England, was also born into a family that practiced inbreeding. The marriage between Isabella and Edward was politically motivated, and it wasn't long before the couple's relationship began to show the effects of this genetic legacy. Isabella's story is a tragic one, as she was ultimately betrayed by her own husband and forced to take control of the English throne. Yet, like Juana, Isabella's struggles were not just about politics, they were also a reflection of the genetic strain placed upon her by her family. Isabella's eventual rebellion against her husband and the subsequent rise to power can be seen as the culmination of the personal trauma she experienced throughout her life. And while her reign was marked by political upheaval, it also illustrates the toll that royal marriages took on the women involved. Historians still argue whether Isabella's actions were the result of a deep-seated desire for power, or whether they were a product of the psychological stress she endured as a result of her family's genetic history. Some even suggest that Isabella's eventual rebellion against Edward was less about the political landscape and more about her own mental health. The combination of inbreeding, political intrigue, and personal betrayal created a perfect storm of emotional instability for Isabella, much like it did for Juana. But while Isabella and Juana both had their struggles, they were far from alone. In their plight, the House of Medici, one of the most powerful families in Renaissance Italy, was also known for its intermarriage and genetic issues. The Medici family was notorious for arranging marriages between cousins, uncles, and aunts, all in an effort to keep power within the family. This practice led to a number of peculiar physical and mental health issues among the Medici descendants. The most famous of these issues was the case of Francesco I de' Medici, who married his cousin, Bianca Capella. Their union was not just politically motivated, but also part of a long-standing tradition of Medici inbreeding. Francesco and Bianca's children suffered from a number of genetic issues, including physical deformities and developmental delays, while the Medici family's wealth and political power allowed them to maintain their influence. The consequences of their genetic choices were undeniable. Historians still argue whether the Medici's practice of inbreeding was the primary cause of their family's decline, or whether it was simply a product of their increasingly unstable political situation. But whatever the cause, it's clear that the practice of marrying close relatives left its mark on the family for generations. The story of the Medici family serves as another reminder of how inbreeding among royal families affected not only the body but the mind. The Medici weren't the only family to suffer from inbreeding's effects. The Spanish Habsburgs, as we've already seen, also faced numerous health issues due to their centuries of inbreeding. The Habsburgs' genetic legacy became so severe that their family line ended in the early 18th century, and historians still debate whether their decline was primarily due to inbreeding, or the political instability they faced in their final years. Either way, it's clear that their genetic decisions played a key role in their downfall. As we look back on these royal families and their struggles, it's hard not to see the consequences of their actions. Inbreeding was not just a quirk of history, it was a deeply destructive practice that left its mark on families for generations. The women in these families, like Juana of Castile, Isabella of France, and the daughters of the Medici, paid the highest price. Their lives were shaped by their family's decisions, and the toll of those choices was felt not only in their bodies, but in their minds as well. Moving forward from the turbulent lives of women like Juana la Loca, let's now explore the fascinating, yet tragic, history of one of the most enigmatic figures in French royal history, Isabella of France. Known for her beauty, cunning, and deep political ambition, Isabella's life was shaped by the same genetic web of inbreeding that trapped so many of her royal peers. Her story is another reminder of the far-reaching consequences of the practice both for the rulers and the subjects they governed. Isabella, born in 1295, was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, a monarch who, like many royals, believed that maintaining the purity of his bloodline was essential for preserving his power. Isabella's marriage to Edward II of England, a union that was meant to solidify the bond between the two nations, would become one of the most infamous relationships in medieval history. But beneath the political maneuvering and royal pageantry lay a marriage fraught with personal conflict, betrayal, and genetic issues that would leave their mark on their children, as well as on the future of both England and France to understand. Isabella's tragic journey, we must first look at the royal bloodline she inherited. Her parents, Philip IV and Queen Joan I of Navarre, were not strangers to the practice of inbreeding. In fact, Isabella's family was notorious for its penchant for keeping marriages within the extended royal family to ensure the preservation of their bloodline. It was not uncommon for first cousins, or even uncles and nieces, to be married within the French and other European royal houses. Isabella's father, Philip IV, was particularly keen on securing power, often marrying his daughters to other royal families in order to extend his influence. But it wasn't just political strategy that played a role in Isabella's fate, was the genetic legacy of inbreeding. Like so many other royal families, Isabella's lineage was marred by the long-term effects of these marriages. Isabella's own mental and physical health would be impacted by the close marriages within her family, although it would take some time for these effects to fully manifest. Isabella's life with Edward II, however, would become the real crucible for her tragic fate. Edward, like many of the men in his family, was beset by a number of issues that historians often attribute to his own family's history of inbreeding. His reign was marked by political turmoil, instability, and his infamous relationship with his male favorites, which ultimately contributed to the breakdown of his marriage to Isabella. Historians still argue whether Edward II's failures as a king were a result of his inbreeding, his infatuation with his male companions, or his inability to fulfill the expectations placed on him as a monarch. Some believe that his behavior was simply a result of poor character and lack of leadership ability. Others argue that his mental instability may have been exacerbated by the genetic strains of his family's long history of intermarriage. Regardless, it's clear that his inability to fulfill his role as king and husband left Isabella deeply frustrated and emotionally distraught. As Isabella's discontent grew, she eventually turned to rebellion. In one of the most dramatic events of her life, Isabella led an invasion of England in 1326, overthrowing her husband and placing her son, Edward III, on the throne. Isabella's rise to power is often romanticized as a tale of a woman who took control of her destiny and struck back at the man who had betrayed her. However, the deeper psychological toll of her life, shaped by her family's genetic issues, cannot be ignored. Historians still argue about Isabella's true motivations. Was she acting out of a desire for power, or was her rebellion a product of the emotional trauma she had endured in her marriage? Some believe that Isabella's rebellion was not only politically motivated, but also the result of years of personal suffering and frustration. Others suggest that Isabella's actions were part of a larger political strategy aimed at securing her son's position on the throne and securing her own legacy. No matter the reason, Isabella's rebellion forever altered the course of English and French history. Isabella's children, too, would suffer the consequences of her family's genetic issues. Her son, Edward III, is remembered as one of the most successful kings of England, yet his reign was also marked by political strife and challenges that may have been influenced by his mother's tumultuous reign. Edward's own family history, shaped by years of royal inbreeding, would continue to affect the decisions and outcomes of the English monarchy for generations to come. But Isabella's story is not the only one that highlights the impact of inbreeding. In royal families, let's take a moment to consider the Medici family, whose influence over Renaissance Italy was as profound as it was controversial. The Medici were not as extreme in their inbreeding as some other royal families, but they certainly had their own share of problems caused by genetic issues. The practice of marrying cousins or uncles and nieces was common within the family, as it was believed that such unions would strengthen the family's power and preserve its wealth and influence. One of the most famous members of the Medici family was Francesco I de' Medici, who married his cousin, Bianca Capello. Their marriage, while politically strategic, was also a product of the Medici's inbreeding practices. Francesco and Bianca's children were marked by a variety of genetic issues, including physical deformities and developmental delays. It was not uncommon for members of the Medici family to suffer from a range of ailments, some of which may have been passed down through generations of inbreeding. Despite these challenges, the Medici family remained one of the most powerful families in Europe, thanks to their wealth and influence in the banking and art worlds. However, the toll of their genetic issues, particularly the physical and mental health problems faced by their children, serves as a reminder of the dangers of inbreeding, even among the most powerful families. In the end, the Medici family's decline was partly due to the effects of inbreeding, as the once great dynasty began to lose its power and influence. The story of the Medici family is just one example of how the consequences of inbreeding affected royal families across Europe. Like the Habsburgs, the Plantagenets, and the Valois, the Medici faced the physical and psychological costs of maintaining a pure bloodline. In the case of Isabella of France, her life was shaped by the political pressures of royal marriage, the personal betrayals of her husband, and the genetic legacy of inbreeding. Her story, like so many others, serves as a cautionary tale of how the obsession with maintaining power and purity through inbreeding can lead to long-lasting and devastating consequences. As we continue to unravel the threads of royal history, we see a recurring theme. The more tightly intertwined these bloodlines became, the more fragile they became as well. And the women caught in these tangled webs were often the ones who suffered the most. Whether it was Isabella of France, Juana of Castile, or the children of the Medici, the effects of inbreeding were far-reaching, leaving behind a legacy of instability, health problems, and a deep sense of tragedy. As we continue to explore the ripple effects of royal inbreeding, it's important to zoom in on the long-standing legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs. This family's genetic issues are often cited as a classic example of how inbreeding among royal families led to devastating consequences. The Spanish Habsburgs, particularly the later generations, suffered from a range of physical and mental health problems that were directly attributed to the practice of marrying within their own family. The inbreeding that plagued this dynasty ultimately led to its downfall and extinction. To understand the full extent of the Habsburgs' genetic troubles, we need to look at how the family's obsession with preserving their royal bloodline played out over several generations. The Habsburgs, one of the most powerful families in Europe during the early modern period, were known for their aggressive marriage strategies. They made it a point to marry within their own family, often choosing cousins, nieces, and other close relatives to ensure that the royal bloodline remained pure. In the eyes of the Habsburgs, this was an essential practice to maintain their power and influence across Europe. However, this obsession with blood purity came at a significant cost. The repeated intermarriages over generations created a genetic bottleneck, meaning that the family's gene pool became increasingly limited, which exacerbated the genetic defects that would later become apparent in the family's descendants. The most famous case of this genetic legacy is King Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. Charles II's physical and mental health problems were severe and well documented. His appearance alone became a symbol of the family's inbreeding troubles. He was born with the unmistakable Habsburg Jan, exaggeratedly protruding lower jaw that was a hallmark of the family's genetic defects. But his issues went far beyond physical appearance. Charles was also mentally impaired, and his cognitive abilities were severely delayed. He struggled with learning, speech, and even basic motor skills. His reign as king was marked by his inability to govern effectively, and he never married or produced an heir, which sealed the fate of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Historians still debate the exact cause of Charles II's physical and mental challenges, but the prevailing theory is that the long-standing tradition of inbreeding in the Habsburg family was largely to blame, while some historians argue that other factors, such as poor health or environmental conditions, may have contributed to his difficulties. The overwhelming consensus is that the repeated generations of cousin marriages led to the severe genetic defects seen in Charles II and other members of the family. Charles II's death in 1700 marked the end of the Spanish Habsburgs, and it was the result of both political instability and genetic decline. The throne of Spain was eventually passed to the Bourbons, who were able to establish a new royal line in Spain, one that, while still dealing with the complexities of European royal politics, was not as severely impacted by inbreeding as the Habsburgs had been. The loss of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain is often seen as a direct consequence of the genetic fallout from their centuries-long marriage practices. This serves as a stark warning about the dangers of excessive inbreeding in royal families. But the Spanish Habsburgs were not the only royal family to suffer from the long-term effects of inbreeding. Across Europe, many other noble families faced similar challenges, though not all of them faced such an extreme downfall. Take, for example, the case of the Romanovs, the last imperial family of Russia. While the Romanovs did not engage in inbreeding to the same extent as the Habsburgs, their family was still impacted by the practice to a certain degree. The Romanovs, like many other European royal families, had a history of marrying cousins or other close relatives to keep their royal bloodline intact. One of the most notable examples of inbreeding within the Romanov family was Serena Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II. Alexandra was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who, as we know, had married within her own royal family. This made Alexandra a product of the same genetic legacy of royal intermarriage that affected so many others. Unfortunately, Alexandra's son, Tsarevich Alexei, inherited a genetic disorder, hemophilia, that had been passed down through the royal bloodline. Hemophilia is a condition that prevents blood from clotting properly, and it can lead to uncontrollable bleeding from even minor injuries. The condition was passed down to Alexei through his mother, Serena Alexandra, who inherited it from her mother, Queen Victoria. Alexei's suffering and eventual death were a direct result of this inherited genetic disorder, and his condition became a significant source of anxiety for the Romanov family. The family's desire to keep the royal bloodline pure contributed to the passing down of this devastating condition, which played a role in the family's ultimate downfall. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Romanov families' inbreeding influenced their tragic end. Some point to the family's genetic issues as a contributing factor to their eventual collapse, while others suggest that political instability, World War I, and the Russian Revolution were more significant causes of the Romanovs' demise. Whatever the case may be, the genetic consequences of inbreeding certainly had a lasting impact on the family, and the tragic death of Tsarevich Alexei remains one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the Romanov story. The legacy of inbreeding in royal families, however, wasn't limited to just these two dynasties. Many other families, from the Habsburgs to the Valois and beyond, faced similar challenges as they intermarried to maintain their power. As we look back on the history of these families, it's clear that inbreeding wasn't just a practice, it was a genetic time bomb that affected not only the rulers but also the people they ruled over. The impact of inbreeding stretched far beyond the royal court, affecting entire nations and shaping the political landscape of Europe for centuries. But while royal families may have been the most visible examples of the effects of inbreeding, it's important to remember that these practices were not limited to the nobility. Throughout history, inbreeding has been a widespread practice among various cultures, including in some aristocratic circles outside of Europe. And while the practice has faded over time, the genetic consequences are still being studied today by scientists who continue to explore the long-term effects of inbreeding on human health. As we conclude this exploration of the tragic and often hidden history of royal inbreeding, we see a clear pattern emerge. The more tightly these bloodlines were kept, the more fragile they became. And the women in these families, like Isabella of France and Serena Alexandra, paid the highest price. They were often trapped in the same genetic web as their male counterparts, suffering from the same physical and psychological effects of inbreeding. Their stories serve as reminders of the dangers of prioritizing bloodlines over the well-being of individuals, and they offer valuable lessons about the intersection of genetics, power, and politics in the royal world. Continuing our journey through the tangled and often tragic history of royal inbreeding, we come to another iconic dynasty that bore the weight of its genetic choices, the Medici family, known for their wealth, political influence, and patronage. Of the arts, the Medici family was one of the most powerful families in Renaissance Italy. However, their history of intermarriage, like that of many other royal families, is riddled with the consequences of inbreeding. The Medici family's rise to power was based on their success in banking, and they eventually used their immense wealth to secure political control over Florence and the surrounding regions. They were not only involved in banking and business, but also played a pivotal role in the cultural and intellectual rebirth of Italy during the Renaissance. Artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Botticelli flourished under the Medici patronage. However, despite their outward success, the Medici family was not immune to the genetic consequences of their royal intermarriages. The Medici family practiced the same strategy that many other European royal families used within their extended family to maintain their wealth and power. Though not as extreme as the Habsburgs, the Medici family still married cousins, uncles, and nieces in an attempt to keep the family's wealth and influence within the bloodline. It wasn't uncommon for Medici heirs to marry relatives who were also deeply embedded in the political and economic networks that sustained the family's power. But, like the Habsburgs, this practice had severe consequences. One of the most well-known examples of the genetic toll of the Medici's inbreeding practices is Francesco I de' Medici. Francesco was the son of Cosimo I de' Medici, the first Grand Duke of Tuscany, and his mother, Eleonora di Toledo, who hailed from a powerful Spanish family. Francesco's marriage to his cousin, Bianca Capello, was part of the Medici tradition of keeping power within the family. However, their union was not just a political maneuver. It also had genetic ramifications that would shape the future. Of the Medici line, Francesco and Bianca's children were born with a variety of physical and mental issues, some of which were likely a result of the genetic strain caused by their parents' inbreeding. Francesco and Bianca's son, for instance, suffered from developmental delays, a sign of possible genetic abnormalities caused by their closely related marriage. Other members of the Medici family also suffered from ailments such as infertility, poor health, and developmental issues. These problems were often downplayed by the family, who were more concerned with their political and social standing than with the health of their offspring. Historians still debate the extent to which the Medici family's inbreeding contributed to their eventual decline. Some argue that the family's diminishing influence and wealth were the result of poor political decisions, economic mismanagement, and the eventual loss of their banking power. Others believe that the genetic issues within the Medici family played a role in their downfall. The combination of inbreeding and political instability certainly weakened the Medici dynasty, and the family's inability to produce healthy heirs eventually led to the end of their political power. But the Medici family was not the only one to suffer from the genetic consequences of inbreeding. Throughout Europe, many royal families were involved in similar practices. One of the most infamous examples of inbreeding among royal families occurred in Spain, where the Habsburg dynasty's obsession with keeping their bloodline pure led to catastrophic results. The Spanish Habsburgs, like many other European monarchs, often married cousins, nieces, and other close relatives in order to consolidate power and preserve their royal bloodline. However, this practice came at a great cost, as the family's genetic health deteriorated over generations. King Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, is perhaps the most well-known example of the devastating effects of royal inbreeding. Charles was born with severe physical and mental health issues, which were widely attributed to the decades of inbreeding that had occurred within the Habsburg family. Charles suffered from a variety of genetic disorders, including a pronounced Habsburg jaw, difficulty speaking, and a range of cognitive impairments. His inability to function as a competent ruler ultimately led to the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. Historians still argue about the extent to which Charles II's physical and mental health were influenced by inbreeding. Some believe that his symptoms were a direct result of the centuries of cousin marriages within the Habsburg family, while others point to other factors, such as the stress of ruling during a period of political instability. Whatever the cause, it's clear that Charles II's reign was profoundly affected by the genetic issues that ran through his family, and his death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. While the Habsburgs and the Medici are perhaps the most famous examples of inbreeding's consequences, they are by no means the only royal families to have suffered from genetic issues. The House of Valois in France, for instance, also faced difficulties related to inbreeding. The Valois family, like the Habsburgs, was known for marrying cousins and other close relatives to maintain their power. This practice led to a variety of genetic issues within the family, including mental instability and infertility. One of the most well-known figures from the House of Valois is King Charles VI of France. Charles, who reigned from 1380 to 1422, suffered from periods of severe mental instability, which historians believe may have been exacerbated by the inbreeding that occurred within his family. Charles was often unable to function as king, and his mental health problems contributed to a period of political chaos in France known as the Madness of Charles VI. His mental state and the subsequent weakening of the French monarchy are often cited as key factors in the instability that plagued France during his reign. Historians still debate whether Charles VI's mental instability was purely a result of inbreeding or whether other factors, such as the stress of war and political intrigue, played a role. Some believe that Charles' madness was a product of his family's genetic issues, while others argue that it was a combination of genetic predisposition and external pressures. Regardless of the cause, it's clear that the inbreeding within the Valois family contributed to the family's eventual decline. In fact, the practice of inbreeding among royal families was so widespread that it became a defining feature of European aristocracy. For centuries, royal families across Europe relied on intermarriage to keep power within their own bloodlines. This practice, while politically advantageous, ultimately led to the genetic deterioration of many royal families. The Habsburgs, the Medici, the Valois, and countless other families all experienced the effects of inbreeding, whether in the form of physical deformities, mental instability, or infertility. But the consequences of inbreeding weren't just confined to the royals themselves. The genetic issues that plagued these families often had far-reaching effects on the nations they ruled. When a king or queen was unable to produce a healthy heir, it created a power vacuum that often led to political instability. The decline of many royal families in Europe can be traced back, at least in part, to the damaging effects of inbreeding. Whether it was the loss of the Habsburgs in Spain or the weakening of the French monarchy under Charles VI, the consequences of intermarriage were felt far beyond the royal court. In the end, the history of royal inbreeding is a stark reminder of the dangers of prioritizing bloodlines over the health and well-being of individuals. These royal families, whose power and wealth once seemed unassailable, were ultimately undone by the very practices that were meant to preserve their legacy. As we look back on their stories, we can't help but wonder what might have happened if these royal families had been able to break free from the cycle of inbreeding and marry outside their immediate bloodlines. Would their dynasties have survived longer? Or was their fate sealed by the very obsession with power that drove them to such extreme measures? As we continue exploring the consequences of royal inbreeding, it's important to look at the broader impact this genetic practice had on the European political landscape. Inbreeding, despite its often devastating effects on the royal families themselves, also reshaped the course of history. It not only affected the individual rulers, but also rippled through the nations they ruled, influencing power structures, dynastic continuity, and national stability. The legacy of inbreeding was far-reaching, and the stories of its effects are not just about personal misfortune. They are also about the broader shifts in European politics that followed. One of the clearest examples of how inbreeding influenced national stability can be found in the fate of the Spanish Habsburgs. As we've seen in previous sections, the Habsburgs were one of the most powerful families in Europe, with an empire that spanned continents. However, by the time Charles II of Spain ascended to the throne, the family had been intermarrying for generations, which led to the complete collapse of their genetic health. Charles II's inability to produce an heir was a direct result of the family's inbreeding. Historians argue that his inability to have children was not just a personal tragedy, but a catastrophe for the entire Spanish Empire. With no heir, the Habsburgs were faced with a succession crisis that left Spain vulnerable to external pressures, and it eventually led to the War of Spanish Succession. This war, fought between European powers for control of the Spanish throne, was a direct consequence of the Habsburgs' inability to maintain a healthy bloodline. The War of Spanish Succession eventually led to the Bourbon dynasty taking control of Spain, marking the end of the Habsburg rule in the country. It was the beginning of a new era for Spain, one in which the Bourbon monarchy, though still facing political challenges, would not suffer from the same genetic issues that plagued the Habsburgs. The shift from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons, though politically significant, can also be seen as a consequence of the long-term effects of inbreeding on the royal family's ability to sustain power. The lesson here is clear. The practice of inbreeding didn't just weaken royal families on a personal level, it had real-world political consequences. The inability of Charles II to produce an heir, combined with the weakening of Spain's power due to the Habsburgs' genetic issues, set the stage for a massive shift in European geopolitics. Inbreeding, therefore, did not only contribute to the decline of individual rulers, it also altered the balance of power in Europe. The impact of inbreeding on the course of history wasn't just confined to Spain. Similar political upheavals occurred in other parts of Europe, where royal families faced their own succession crises due to inbreeding. For instance, the tragic decline of the Habsburgs was mirrored by the eventual downfall of other powerful European dynasties. While the French monarchy managed to avoid such a catastrophic outcome, it, too, was not immune to the genetic consequences of royal inbreeding. The House of Valois, which ruled France from the 14th to the 16th centuries, experienced significant instability partly due to inbreeding practices. While the Valois did not marry as frequently within their immediate family as the Habsburgs, they still maintained strong ties through intermarriages with other European royal families. As we've seen with other families, these practices led to a weakening of their ability to maintain control and power. The most striking example of the effects of inbreeding on the Valois family was the reign of Charles VI, whose periods of madness significantly disrupted France's ability to function as a unified nation. Charles VI's mental instability, which historians now believe may have been exacerbated by inbreeding, caused a political crisis that left France vulnerable to external threats, most notably the English during the 100 Years' War. While the causes of Charles VI's condition are still debated, there's little doubt that the Valois family's practice of marrying within their extended family contributed to his struggles. The political instability caused by Charles VI's madness led to the division of France into factions that ultimately undermined the monarchy's strength. Inbreeding was not the sole cause of France's political troubles during this time, but it certainly played a role in destabilizing the Valois dynasty. Just like the Habsburgs, the Valois were caught in a cycle of political and genetic fragility that ultimately led to their decline. Similarly, the impact of inbreeding extended beyond Europe. While European royal families are the most famous examples of this practice, inbreeding was also practiced by other aristocratic families around the world. In some Middle Eastern and Asian dynasties, inbreeding was seen as a way to keep power within the family and avoid the dilution of royal bloodlines. But even in these regions, the long-term genetic effects of inbreeding were felt, often manifesting in health issues that ultimately destabilized ruling families. For example, in ancient Egypt, the practice of royal sibling marriages was prevalent. Among the pharaohs, the most famous case is that of King Tutankhamun, whose parents were likely siblings. Genetic studies have shown that Tutankhamun suffered from a number of health problems, including a cleft palate and a clubbed foot. These physical defects were likely the result of his parents' close genetic relationship, and they contributed to his premature death at the age of 18. While the practice of sibling marriage was meant to preserve the power of the royal family, it ultimately led to the weakening of the dynasty. Tutankhamun's death without an heir led to a rapid decline in the power of the 18th dynasty, and Egypt would soon enter a period of political instability. The genetic issues that resulted from inbreeding played a role in the destabilization of the ancient Egyptian monarchy, much as they did in Europe. The impact of inbreeding on the political landscape extends even further when we consider the legacy of these royal families. Many of the dynasties that practiced inbreeding left behind records of their reigns, providing modern historians with invaluable insight. into the ways in which genetic issues and political instability intertwined. These records, which document the health problems, mental instability, and succession crises caused by inbreeding, offer a window into the consequences of a practice that often went unchecked for centuries. The tragic consequences of inbreeding in royal families serve as a powerful reminder of the dangers of prioritizing bloodlines over the well-being of individuals. These families, obsessed with maintaining their power and control, often overlooked the long-term genetic consequences of their practices. Their downfall was not only a result of poor political decisions, but also a consequence of their failure to recognize the inherent risks of inbreeding. In examining the broader effects of inbreeding on royal families, we see that the consequences were not just confined to the rulers themselves. The political instability and shifting power dynamics that resulted from inbreeding left lasting marks on entire nations. The rise and fall of royal families like the Habsburgs and the Valois were shaped by a combination of genetic factors and political instability, creating a legacy that still fascinates historians today. As we continue to trace the consequences of royal inbreeding, it's crucial to understand that the effects weren't just confined to individual health problems or personal failures. Inbreeding played a significant role in the power dynamics of Europe, shaping not only the fates of individual rulers, but also influencing entire nations, cultures, and political landscapes. One of the most devastating outcomes of inbreeding was the downfall of the Plantagenets, the royal family that ruled England from the 12th to the 15th centuries. Their dynasty, like so many others, suffered from the genetic consequences of strategic marriages within their own extended family. The Plantagenets were not as extreme as the Habsburgs in terms of inbreeding, but they still practiced it to ensure the consolidation of power. The Plantagenet kings of England, such as Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John, often married relatives within the European aristocracy. These marriages were strategic, designed to strengthen political alliances, consolidate land, and ensure that power remained within the family. However, over time, the genetic toll of these unions became apparent in the health and behavior of their descendants. One of the most well-known examples of genetic issues within the Plantagenet family is King Richard III. As we mentioned earlier, Richard III's physical deformity, his famous hunchback, is often cited as a result of inbreeding within the Plantagenet family. Although some historians have questioned whether Richard's condition was solely a result of genetics or whether other factors played a role, it's clear that his family's marriage practices contributed to his physical deformity. Richard's condition became a symbol of the family's declining genetic health, and is often used as a poignant example of the dangerous consequences of inbreeding among royals. Historians still argue over the extent to which inbreeding contributed to Richard III's condition. While some believe it was a direct result of his family's inbreeding, others suggest that Richard's hunchback may have been the result of a childhood illness or other environmental factors. Regardless of the cause, Richard's hunchback became an enduring symbol of the Plantagenets' genetic troubles. His physical condition, paired with his controversial reign and eventual defeat at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor era. The impact of inbreeding within the Plantagenet family, however, went beyond Richard III. His cousin, King Henry VI, also suffered from significant mental health issues that many historians believe were exacerbated by the Plantagenet bloodline. Henry VI's mental instability led to a period of civil war in England known as the Wars of the Roses. which ultimately resulted in the Plantagenet family losing its grip on the throne. The genetic instability within the Plantagenet family not only led to personal suffering, but also directly contributed to the collapse of the family's political power. While the Plantagenets faced their own set of challenges, their reign also underscores a broader pattern that can be seen across other European royal families. The practice of inbreeding often led to the weakening of the family line, both politically and genetically. The genetic toll of repeated cousin marriages, sibling marriages, and other forms of close kinship unions was felt across Europe, contributing to the collapse of powerful dynasties and the rise of new ones. The impact of inbreeding within royal families was not limited to the mental and physical health of individual rulers. It also had significant implications for the stability and future of the kingdom. As we saw with the Plantagenets, when the family's health was compromised, so too was the stability of the kingdom they ruled. Richard III's failure to secure a healthy heir, coupled with his physical deformities, made him a less effective leader, and his inability to consolidate power contributed to the downfall of the Plantagenet dynasty. Looking further across the European landscape, the Spanish Habsburgs provide another poignant example of the political ramifications of inbreeding. As we explored in earlier sections, the Habsburgs' obsessive inbreeding led to severe genetic defects, including mental and physical disabilities, within their royal line. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, suffered from a host of genetic problems that severely impacted his ability to rule. Charles II was incapable of producing an heir, and his failure to secure a successor marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. The collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs also had significant consequences for the stability of Spain. The inability of Charles II to secure an heir led to the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that drew in multiple European powers. The war ultimately resulted in the Bourbons taking control of Spain, which shifted the balance of power in Europe. This is yet another example of how the genetic and political consequences of inbreeding extended far beyond the royal family itself and contributed to broader geopolitical shifts. The Habsburgs, like the Plantagenets, were caught in a cycle of inbreeding that weakened their genetic health and their political power. Over time, the family's efforts to maintain control through bloodlines led to a catastrophic weakening of their dynasty. In the case of the Habsburgs, their genetic decline played a key role in the shifting political alliances of the 18th century. Spain's loss of influence in Europe can, in part, be attributed to the Habsburgs' inability to produce healthy heirs and secure their political future. However, the effects of royal inbreeding were not just confined to European royal families. In other parts of the world, royal families engaged in similar practices, and the consequences of inbreeding played a similar role in their decline. One example is the family of the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, where sibling marriages were common. The famous case of Tutankhamun highlights how the practice of marrying close relatives can result in severe genetic issues. Tutankhamun's health problems, including his clubbed foot and cleft palate, were likely the result of his parents' sibling marriage. His early death and lack of a clear heir destabilized the power structure of the Egyptian royal family, contributing to the collapse of the 18th dynasty. While ancient Egyptian inbreeding practices may seem far removed from the European monarchies, they serve as another example of how this practice can lead to the downfall of powerful dynasties. The genetic consequences of inbreeding have transcended time and geography, affecting royal families across the globe. Whether in Europe, Egypt, or elsewhere, inbreeding has consistently led to the same tragic results: weakened rulers, unstable dynasties, and ultimately the collapse of entire kingdoms. In conclusion, the history of royal inbreeding is a story not just of individual rulers and their struggles, but of the broader political consequences of maintaining power through bloodlines. The Plantagenets, the Habsburgs, and many others were trapped in a cycle of inbreeding that led to a decline in their genetic health, which in turn contributed to the collapse of their political power. Inbreeding's impact on royal families has shaped history in ways that still reverberate today. Whether it's the tragic fate of Charles II of Spain, the mental instability of King Henry VI of England, or the health problems of Tutankhamun, the consequences of inbreeding were and ultimately played a key role in the political upheavals of the past. As we continue to unravel the story of inbreeding in royal families, it becomes increasingly clear that the repercussions were not simply a matter of genetic defects or personal health. The practice of marrying within one's bloodline didn't just affect the royal families themselves, had far-reaching consequences for the very nations they ruled. The intertwining of power, genetics, and politics in these royal families contributed not only to their internal struggles, but also to the instability of entire regions. Let's now examine how inbreeding in the House of Valois, one of the most powerful and long-standing dynasties in France, served as a significant turning point in European history. The Valois family ruled France from 1328 to 1589, and during their reign, they played a crucial role in shaping the political and cultural landscape of Europe. However, their relentless focus on maintaining royal bloodlines within the family had serious long-term effects, both on the family and the nation itself. The Valois were known for engaging in cousin marriages and other close-knit alliances, all in the name of consolidating power and keeping the throne within their bloodline. But this practice, while politically advantageous in the short term, led to genetic problems that weakened the family's future generations. The most notable example of the consequences of inbreeding within the Valois family is King Charles VI of France, who is often referred to as Charles the Mad. His reign, which began in 1380, was marred by long periods of mental instability, and historians widely believe that his condition was exacerbated by the genetic consequences of inbreeding. Charles V's mental health deteriorated to the point where he was incapable of ruling effectively. At times, he would exhibit erratic behavior, including periods of complete insanity, which often left the kingdom in chaos. His inability to manage the affairs of the state created a power vacuum, which was filled by various factions within the court. This contributed to a period of political instability in France, which weakened the monarchy and made the country vulnerable to external threats, most notably from England during the 100 Years' War. Historians still debate whether Charles VI's condition was solely caused by inbreeding or whether other factors, such as the immense stress of war and the political intrigue of his court, played a role. Some suggest that the combination of genetic predisposition and external pressures led to his eventual breakdown. However, what is clear is that the instability caused by Charles' mental illness had profound consequences for France. His inability to rule effectively weakened the French monarchy, contributing to the division of the nation and the eventual rise of powerful factions within the kingdom. This period of instability, which began during Charles VI's reign, would go on to shape the future of France. The resulting civil unrest between the factions loyal to Charles and those loyal to his son, the Dauphin, later Charles VII, eventually led to the Burgundian faction, aligned with the English, gaining significant influence over France. This civil strife directly contributed to the eventual English victory in parts of the 100 Years' War, which would last for several more decades before France managed to regain control. The long-term consequences of the Valois family's inbreeding were profound. The genetic instability within the family, compounded by political challenges, played a central role in the weakening of the French monarchy during a critical period in European history. The civil wars that followed Charles VI's reign further undermined the authority of the monarchy, making it difficult for France to maintain its political cohesion. But the French monarchy wasn't the only European power to suffer from the consequences of inbreeding. Moving eastward to Russia, we find a striking example in the Romanov family, the last ruling dynasty of Russia. The Romanovs ruled Russia for over 3 centuries, but their reign was also marked by genetic instability and the devastating consequences of inbreeding. The family's struggle with genetic disorders would play a role in the family's ultimate downfall and the end of the Russian Empire. The Romanov family, like many other royal families, was connected by a web of marriages within the European aristocracy. Tsarina Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who had made several strategic marriages within her own family. These marriages, though politically advantageous, led to the transmission of genetic disorders such as hemophilia, a blood-clotting disorder that plagued the Romanov family. The most tragic victim of this genetic disorder was Tsarevich Alexei, the youngest son of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, and his condition caused immense distress for his parents. The royal couple, deeply concerned about their son's health, sought out various medical treatments, but there was little that could be done to manage his bleeding episodes. Alexei's suffering became a source of great emotional strain for his family, and his eventual death at a young age further contributed to the unraveling of the Romanov dynasty. Historians argue that the genetic legacy of hemophilia played a significant role in the family's downfall. While the Russian Empire faced many political challenges, including social unrest and revolutionary movements, the suffering of the Romanovs, due to their inherited genetic disorders, undoubtedly weakened the family's ability to respond to these crises. Tsarina Alexandra's intense devotion to her son and her refusal to separate herself from him only deepened her sense of isolation from the Russian people, further eroding the monarchy's credibility. The ultimate fall of the Romanovs came in 1917, during the Russian Revolution, when Tsar Nicholas II and his family were overthrown and executed. The end of the Romanov dynasty was a direct result of the broader political and social upheaval in Russia, but the genetic struggles within the family also contributed to their inability to effectively manage these challenges. The emotional toll of Alexei's condition, combined with the family's genetic instability, created a situation where the Romanovs were unable to maintain their authority in the face of rising revolutionary sentiment. This story of the Romanovs, much like the story of the Habsburgs and the Valois, serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of inbreeding in royal families. While inbreeding was often seen as a way to preserve power and control, it ultimately led to genetic issues that destabilized royal families and contributed to their decline. The Romanovs, despite their long and storied reign, were no exception to this pattern. Their story is intertwined with the history of Europe's other royal families, all of whom were affected by the devastating genetic consequences of their intermarriages. Looking at the broader scope of royal inbreeding, it's clear that the impact was not only genetic but political. The obsession with maintaining bloodlines while ensuring the survival of dynasties often undermined the very stability these royal families sought to protect. From the Valois in France to the Romanovs in Russia, inbreeding played a key role in shaping the political landscape of Europe. In the end, these dynasties, despite their power, wealth, and influence, were not able to overcome the genetic and political consequences of their intermarriages. Their stories remain a cautionary tale of how the practice of inbreeding, though once seen as a safeguard for royal power, ultimately contributed to the downfall of some of the most powerful families in history. As we explore the history of royal inbreeding and its consequences, it becomes clear that the legacy of this practice was not only defined by its negative effects on individual rulers, but also by the lasting impact it had on the political, cultural, and social structures of entire nations. The end of one royal family often marked the rise of another, and in many cases, this was due to the genetic decline of the former rulers, who found themselves incapable of continuing their dynasties. Let's now turn our attention to the final chapter of the Habsburg dynasty, which offers a telling case study of how royal inbreeding not only led to the end of a powerful family, but also shaped the course of European history. While we've already discussed the tragic reign of Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, it's important to understand the broader context of how the Habsburgs' inbreeding practices set the stage for their eventual extinction. The decline of the Habsburgs was not a singular event, but the culmination of several generations of inbreeding and the resulting health issues that weakened the family from within. The Spanish Habsburgs, at their peak, ruled an empire that spanned across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia. Their vast empire was founded on the principle of dynastic marriages, with royal unions arranged to consolidate power across various European nations. This policy of intermarriage, while politically advantageous in the short term, had severe consequences for the Habsburg family's genetic health. By the time Charles II came to the throne, the family's genetic pool had become so limited that they were, essentially, playing a game of genetic Russian roulette. Charles II's birth marked the beginning of the end for the Spanish Habsburgs. His inability to produce an heir, coupled with his severe physical and mental disabilities, highlighted the devastating effects of the family's inbreeding. As we discussed earlier, Charles was unable to speak or walk properly as a child, and his physical deformities, including a prominent Habsburg jaw, were the result of several generations of cousin marriages. His cognitive impairments, along with his inability to govern effectively, meant that he was a weak monarch at best, unable to make the critical decisions that could have preserved his family's hold on power. Historians still debate the exact role that Charles II's genetic issues played in the ultimate collapse of the Habsburg dynasty. Some believe that his physical and mental disabilities were the result of his family's inbreeding practices, while others argue that political instability and external pressures contributed more to the family's decline. Regardless of the cause, it's clear that Charles II's reign was one of the most tumultuous in Spanish history, and the consequences of his inability to produce an heir were far-reaching. When Charles II died in 1700, without a successor to take the throne, the War of Spanish Succession broke out. This war, fought between European powers for control of the Spanish throne, was the direct result of the Habsburgs' inability to secure their bloodline. The war ultimately led to the rise of the Bourbon family in Spain, replacing the Habsburgs and marking the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. The Bourbon family's ascension to the throne was not just a political shift, was the beginning of a new era for Spain, one that was not burdened by the genetic issues that had plagued the Habsburgs. The shift from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons also had profound implications for the balance of power in Europe. The War of Spanish Succession was a conflict that involved several European powers, including France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, all of whom sought to control the fate of Spain and its vast empire. The outcome of the war fundamentally altered the political landscape of Europe, with the Bourbons establishing a new dynasty that would continue to rule Spain for centuries to come. While the Bourbons were able to avoid the genetic pitfalls of inbreeding, their rise to power came at a significant cost to the Habsburgs. The Spanish Habsburgs' genetic decline, which had been building over several generations, played a crucial role in their eventual downfall. The inability of Charles II to produce a healthy heir set the stage for the Bourbon takeover, and in many ways, the War of Spanish Succession can be seen as a direct consequence of the Habsburgs' inbreeding practices. However, the Habsburgs were not alone in their downfall due to inbreeding. The royal families of Europe, while often depicted as invincible, were repeatedly undone by the very genetic practices they believed would preserve their power. The decline of the Habsburgs, the Plantagenets, the Valois, and others serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of excessive inbreeding, particularly when it comes to matters of succession and political stability. The story of royal inbreeding is not just one of personal tragedy, but also one of dynastic failure. The failure to produce healthy heirs, the inability to maintain political control, and the eventual decline of entire families were the consequences of a practice that prioritized bloodlines over the well-being of individuals. These families, while incredibly powerful in their time, were ultimately undone by their obsession with maintaining a pure and unbroken bloodline. It is important to recognize that while inbreeding played a significant role in the decline of these royal families, it was not the sole factor in their fall from power. The political, military, and economic factors of the time were also crucial in shaping the fate of these dynasties. However, the genetic consequences of inbreeding created a fragile foundation upon which these families built their power. In the end, the genetic toll of inbreeding proved to be more than these dynasties could withstand, and their collapse was inevitable. The decline of the Habsburgs and other royal families serves as a cautionary tale for future generations. The obsession with bloodlines and the pursuit of power through strategic marriages left these families vulnerable to the long-term consequences of inbreeding. While royal families may have believed that keeping their bloodlines pure would protect their power and influence, history shows that the opposite was true. Inbreeding, rather than preserving dynastic strength, ultimately led to the downfall of some of the most powerful families in European history. In conclusion, the history of royal inbreeding is not just a story of genetic decline. It is a story of political failure. The inability of royal families to break free from the cycle of inbreeding ultimately weakened their power and contributed to their demise. From the Habsburgs to the Plantagenets to the Valois, the practice of inbreeding left a mark on European history that cannot be overlooked. The rise and fall of these dynasties remind us of the dangers of prioritizing bloodlines over the health and well-being of individuals, and the lasting impact of these practices on the political landscape of Europe. In looking at the history of royal inbreeding, we cannot ignore one of the most infamous cases of genetic decline due to intermarriage, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and her progeny. Her story intertwines with that of her descendants, who inherited not only the throne but also genetic disorders due to the pervasive practice of cousin marriages. The infamous legacy of haemophilia, often referred to as the royal disease, provides one of the most striking examples of how inbreeding led to serious genetic issues and contributed to political and dynastic struggles across Europe. Queen Victoria, the second longest reigning monarch in British history, ruled the United Kingdom from 1837 until her death in 1901. Her reign, known as the Victorian era, was marked by significant social, cultural, and scientific changes. During her reign, Britain became a global superpower, and Queen Victoria became the symbolic matriarch of Europe. What many don't realize, however, is that Queen Victoria's reign, and that of her descendants, was also marked by the quiet and tragic inheritance of a genetic disease that began to take its toll on her family. At the heart of this story is the relationship between Queen Victoria and her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, whom she married in 1840. The marriage, like many royal unions, was a political alliance meant to consolidate power and strengthen royal ties between European monarchies. While the love between Victoria and Albert was genuine, their marriage produced a number of children who inherited not only their royal titles, but also the genetic disorders that would plague the family for generations. What many people don't know is that Queen Victoria, though she was not aware of it at the time, was a carrier of haemophilia, a hereditary blood disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. Haemophilia had been carried through the royal family's bloodline, and Queen Victoria unknowingly passed it on to her children. As it turned out, this disease would affect many of her descendants across Europe, and its impact would go on to shape not only the health of her family, but also the political landscape of European monarchies. Queen Victoria's son, Leopold, Duke of Albany, was one of the first members of the royal family to suffer from haemophilia. As a young boy, he experienced frequent and severe bleeding episodes. Tragically, Leopold died at the age of 30, after falling and suffering internal bleeding from which he could not recover. The tragic death of Leopold highlighted the genetic consequences of Victoria's bloodline and the enduring impact of inbreeding within royal families. His death was just one in a series of tragic events that marked the family, and it was only the beginning of the suffering caused by this inherited disorder. Historians still argue about the extent to which Queen Victoria's inbreeding with Prince Albert contributed to the spread of haemophilia through her family. While some believe that the disorder may have been a result of Victoria's genetic predisposition, others argue that her close family connections through marriage, particularly the repeated marriages among cousins, played a significant role in transmitting the disease. Regardless, the story of haemophilia's spread through the royal family underscores the dangers of the practice of marrying close relatives. What began as a seemingly innocent political union between Queen Victoria and her cousin would come to haunt the entire royal family for generations. The inheritance of haemophilia didn't stop with Queen Victoria's immediate descendants. The disease was passed down to many of her grandchildren, as Victoria and Albert's children married into other royal families throughout Europe. One of the most notable cases of haemophilia spreading across royal lines was seen in the Russian Romanov family. Tsarina Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, making her a carrier of the same haemophilia gene. Tsarevich Alexei, the youngest son of Nicholas and Alexandra, inherited the disorder and suffered greatly throughout his short life. His haemophilia contributed to his early death and was a source of immense personal grief for his parents. Historians still debate whether Alexandra's tragic devotion to her son and the secrecy surrounding his illness were the result of a mother's desperation or the debilitating impact of inbreeding. Some believe that Alexandra's emotional isolation, which was exacerbated by the constant fear for Alexi's life, was a direct result of the genetic burden carried by her family. Others argue that the political pressures of being part of the Romanov family, along with her intense personal devotion to Alexei, played a role in her isolation. Either way, it's clear that the inheritance of hemophilia, which had passed down through the generations of Queen Victoria's descendants, significantly impacted the Romanov family and contributed to the eventual downfall of the Russian monarchy. The story of hemophilia in European royal families serves as a striking example of how inbreeding not only affects individuals but can also change the course of history. In this case, the royal families of Europe, particularly the British and Russian monarchies, were deeply affected by the inheritance of a single genetic disorder. While the disease may have seemed like an isolated issue at first, its impact was far-reaching and contributed to the ultimate collapse of two of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. In addition to the direct consequences of inbreeding, the spread of hemophilia through the royal family also had significant political ramifications. The connections between European royal families were, after all, political in nature. Marriages between royals were often arranged to solidify alliances, and the ties between families like the British, Russian, and Spanish royal houses were essential to maintaining political influence in Europe. When hemophilia became an issue, it not only caused personal grief for the royal families, but also undermined their ability to maintain power and authority. The eventual fall of the Romanov dynasty in 1917, driven by the Russian Revolution, was deeply intertwined with the genetic struggles within the family. Serena Alexandra's emotional isolation and her focus on Alexei's health, as well as the widespread political unrest in Russia, all contributed to the royal family's inability to maintain their hold on power. When the Bolsheviks seized control, it marked the end of centuries of Romanov rule, and the family's tragic history, marked by both political and genetic challenges, was sealed in a moment of violent upheaval. Similarly, the British monarchy, despite surviving Queen Victoria's genetic legacy, faced its own set of challenges as a result of hemophilia's impact on their family. While the disease did not directly lead to the downfall of the British royal family, the consequences of inbreeding and the personal tragedies associated with it affected the public perception of the monarchy. The royal family's struggles with genetic disorders, combined with the emotional toll it took on its members, changed the way European monarchies were viewed in the 20th century. Queen Victoria's descendants and the inheritance of hemophilia offer a powerful reminder of the lasting consequences of inbreeding within royal families. What began as a practice designed to secure power and influence ended up contributing to personal suffering, dynastic collapse, and the reshaping of European history. The royal families of Europe, who were once seen as invincible, were often brought to their knees by the genetic consequences of their intermarriages, and the legacy of hemophilia serves as one of the most poignant examples of how inbreeding led to both personal and political tragedy. As we delve deeper into the impact of inbreeding on royal families, it becomes increasingly clear that the consequences went far beyond just genetic disorders or political instability. The ramifications of maintaining royal bloodlines through intermarriage affected not only the physical and mental well-being of individual monarchs, but also the societies and countries they governed. One of the most striking aspects of inbreeding's impact was how it contributed to the collapse of entire dynasties and the rise of new powers that eventually reshaped the political map of Europe. In addition to the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and The Valois, one of the most prominent cases of inbreeding's devastating impact, can be found in the Spanish monarchy. The Spanish Habsburgs, as we've seen, were infamous for their genetic decline, which resulted from multiple generations of cousin marriages and other forms of intermarriage within the family. But the Spanish Habsburgs were not the only royal family to suffer from the toll of inbreeding. The influence of this practice extended well beyond the royal court and had far-reaching political consequences. The Spanish monarchy's practice of inbreeding was not a unique one. Rather, it was a common strategy used by many European monarchies to consolidate power. In the case of Spain, the monarchy's obsession with maintaining a pure royal bloodline led to the development of a powerful, though ultimately doomed, political strategy, the Habsburg system of By the time Charles II ascended to the throne, this system had reached its peak, with several generations of Habsburg monarchs marrying their cousins, uncles, nieces, and even siblings to maintain the family's hold on power. The tragic and ultimately fatal flaw in this strategy was the genetic toll it took on the Habsburg family. As Charles II's reign demonstrated, the genetic defects caused by inbreeding ultimately led to the collapse of the family. Charles II, despite being born into one of the most powerful royal families in Europe, was physically and mentally disabled. His inability to produce an heir and his failure to rule effectively were consequences of the family's long-standing practice of inbreeding, and they were the final nails in the coffin for the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Historians still debate whether the decline of the Spanish Habsburgs was solely due to inbreeding, or whether other factors, such as political instability, economic decline, and the increasing strength of rival European powers, played a role in their downfall. However, there's little doubt that the genetic problems that plagued the Habsburgs were a significant factor in their inability to maintain power. Charles II's failure to produce a healthy heir left Spain vulnerable to external threats, and this power vacuum was quickly filled by the Bourbon family, who ultimately took control of Spain after the War of Spanish Succession. The transition from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons was a critical turning point in European history. The rise of the Bourbon dynasty not only marked the end of the Habsburgs in Spain, but also shifted the balance of power in Europe. The Bourbons, unlike the Habsburgs, were able to establish a new, more stable royal bloodline, and their reign would continue for centuries. The Bourbon family's ascension to the throne of Spain, aided by the power shift in the wake of the Habsburg decline, dramatically altered the course of Spanish and European history. While the Bourbon family was not completely free from the genetic consequences of inbreeding, their bloodline was far more resilient than that of the Spanish Habsburgs. The Bourbons, in contrast to their Habsburg predecessors, made efforts to marry outside of the family, which allowed them to maintain a healthier gene pool and avoid the catastrophic decline that plagued the Habsburgs. The political and social stability that the Bourbons brought to Spain helped to solidify their place in history and ensured the survival of the Spanish monarchy long after the Habsburgs' reign came to an end. While the rise of the Bourbons in Spain marked the end of one royal family, it also set the stage for the broader political and dynastic shifts that would follow. As the Habsburgs' genetic decline created a power vacuum in Spain, other European powers began to jockey for influence, leading to a reconfiguration of alliances and the eventual reshaping of Europe's political landscape. The War of Spanish Succession, which was fought to determine the rightful heir to the Spanish throne, not only marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty, but also reshaped the balance of power across the continent, ensuring that new powers would emerge to fill the vacuum left behind by the weakening Habsburgs. Beyond the Habsburgs and Bourbons, Royal inbreeding also played a significant role in the political changes seen in other parts of Europe. The House of Stuart, which ruled Scotland and later England, is another example of how inbreeding within royal families could impact political stability. While the Stuarts were not as extreme in their inbreeding practices as some other European monarchies, they too engaged in the practice of marrying within the family to preserve royal bloodlines. This strategy, though politically strategic, led to a number of health issues within the family, some of which were linked to inbreeding. Perhaps the most famous example of the genetic toll of royal inbreeding within the Stuart family was the health of Queen Anne, the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty. Queen Anne, who ruled England from 1702 until her death in 1714, suffered from numerous health issues throughout her life, including multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Historians have suggested that some of these health issues may have been related to the genetic consequences of inbreeding within the Stuart family, although there is no definitive proof. In any case, Queen Anne's inability to produce a healthy heir marked the end of the Stuart dynasty and the beginning of the Hanoverian era in England. The passing of the crown from Anne to George I, a distant relative from the House of Hanover, further illustrates the ways in which the practice of royal inbreeding led to political shifts that would ultimately shape the future of the British monarchy. The story of inbreeding in royal families serves as a powerful reminder of the political and genetic costs of prioritizing bloodlines over the health and well-being of individuals. From the Habsburgs to the Stuarts, the consequences of inbreeding were not limited to personal tragedy, but also contributed to the larger political upheavals that marked the rise and fall of dynasties. These royal families, despite their power and influence, were ultimately undone by the very practice that they believed would secure their futures. In the end, the genetic consequences of inbreeding weakened these once great families, leading to the collapse of their dynasties and the emergence of new powers. It's important to remember that the legacy of royal inbreeding is not just a cautionary tale about the dangers of genetic decline. It's also a reminder of the fragile nature of political power. In many cases, royal families' obsession with maintaining pure bloodlines blinded them to the political realities of their time. The political instability caused by inbreeding, coupled with the inability to produce healthy heirs, led to the downfall of dynasties that had once been unassailable. As we look back on the history of royal inbreeding, we see a clear pattern emerge. Dynasties that prioritized bloodlines above all else were often the ones that crumbled the fastest. The Habsburgs, the Stuarts, and many others were caught in a cycle of inbreeding that ultimately contributed to their demise. Their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the risks of obsession with bloodlines and the long-term consequences of maintaining power at the expense of individual well-being. As we continue to trace the lineage of royal families and the consequences of inbreeding, one dynasty stands out due to its enduring impact on European politics: the Romanovs. The Romanov family ruled Russia for over 3 centuries, making them one of the longest reigning royal families in European history. Yet, despite their centuries of power, their downfall was significantly influenced by the genetic consequences of inbreeding, which not only led to their tragic end, but also served as a reflection of the larger challenges faced by royal families who practiced inbreeding. The Romanovs' relationship with Queen Victoria is often cited as one of the most telling examples of how inbreeding spread through royal families across Europe. Serena Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria through their shared bloodlines. Alexandra became a carrier of haemophilia, the same genetic disorder that plagued the descendants of Queen Victoria. Hemophilia, a condition that prevents the blood from clotting, became known as the royal disease because it appeared in the families of European monarchs who were intermarrying in an effort to keep power within the royal bloodlines. The most tragic and direct consequence of Alexandra's genetic inheritance was her son, Tsarevich Alexei. From a very young age, Alexei's hemophilia became apparent. The boy's condition caused constant concern for his parents, as the slightest injury could result in life-threatening bleeding. This fear, coupled with the extreme measures taken by the royal family to protect Alexei, isolated them from the Russian people. Serena Alexandra, in particular, became deeply devoted to finding a cure for her son's condition. This devotion led her to form a controversial relationship with Grigory Rasputin, a mystic whom she believed had the power to heal Alexei's hemophilia. This relationship, although rooted in a mother's desperation, would have disastrous political consequences. The Romanovs' struggle with hemophilia and the deep emotional strain it caused the family were not just personal tragedies, but also political miscalculations. Serena Alexandra's reliance on Rasputin to treat Alexei and the perception that she and Nicholas II were under Rasputin's influence caused significant unrest within Russian society. Rasputin's apparent control over the royal family alienated the Russian nobility, while his political influence further fueled revolutionary sentiment among the Russian people. Many saw Rasputin as a symbol of the royal family's disconnection from reality and their inability to govern effectively. This led to widespread dissatisfaction with the monarchy, which, in turn, contributed to the growing revolutionary fervor that eventually led to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Historians still argue whether the Romanovs' downfall was purely the result of the genetic issues that plagued their family, or whether political instability, economic hardship, and World War I played a more significant role. Some contend that the family's genetic issues created an environment of emotional instability and a lack of effective leadership. Others argue that the revolutionary movements in Russia were driven more by social and economic conditions than by the family's health problems. However, what is clear is that the genetic issues within the Romanov family, particularly Alexei's hemophilia, exacerbated the royal family's isolation from the Russian people. The perception that the Romanovs were weak and incapable of ruling effectively contributed to their eventual downfall. When Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne in 1917, it marked the end of the Romanov dynasty, and the family was placed under house arrest. In July of that year, Nicholas Alexandra and their children, including Alexei, were executed by Bolsheviks. The tragic end of the Romanov family, following the death of their son, Alexei, encapsulates the consequences of inbreeding, not just in terms of genetics, but also in terms of the erosion of political power. While Russia was facing massive political upheaval and social unrest, the royal family's inability to effectively govern, compounded by their genetic health problems, served as a catalyst for the revolution. The legacy of the Romanovs also highlights a broader pattern in royal history: the struggle between maintaining a pure bloodline and ensuring the survival of the dynasty through effective governance. For the Romanovs, as for so many other royal families, the obsession with maintaining a royal bloodline through intermarriage led to genetic disorders that undermined their ability to lead. In the case of the Romanovs, their failure to produce a healthy heir and their reliance on mysticism and political miscalculations ultimately led to the collapse of their monarchy. While the Romanovs faced challenges that were specific to their own dynasty, their story is not isolated. It mirrors the experiences of many other royal families who struggled with the genetic consequences of inbreeding. The Habsburgs, for instance, were also a family whose obsession with maintaining bloodlines led to severe genetic disorders, including mental and physical health issues. The Habsburg dynasty, once one of the most powerful in Europe, ultimately crumbled due to a combination of inbreeding, political instability, and the inability to produce a healthy heir. The Romanovs' failure to secure the future of their dynasty was not only a result of personal and genetic misfortune, but also of the broader political and social context in which they ruled. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was driven by widespread dissatisfaction with the monarchy, compounded by the immense hardship caused by World War I, however. The Romanovs' inability to produce a healthy heir, coupled with their emotional isolation, due to Alexei's condition, left them vulnerable to the tides of history. The family's downfall marked the end of more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule, but it also signaled a larger shift in European politics. As the age of monarchies began to wane, the tragedy of the Romanovs and the collapse of the Russian monarchy serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of inbreeding within royal families. While these families were once the epitome of power and influence, they were ultimately undone by their failure to recognize the inherent dangers of preserving bloodlines at all costs. The story of the Romanovs is one of tragedy, but it also reflects the broader challenges faced by royal families throughout history. Their decline due to inbreeding serves as a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of power, when tied to genetic preservation, can lead to the very downfall of the family and the collapse of dynasties. For the Russian people, the fall of the Romanovs marked the beginning of a new era. The Bolshevik Revolution ushered in the rise of communism, which fundamentally reshaped the political and social landscape of Russia and the world. The tragic end of the Romanov family, with the brutal execution of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, Alexandra, and their children, marks the end of an era in Russian history. But it also serves as a sobering reminder of the fragility of dynasties and the human cost of inbreeding, as well as the delicate balance between power and the well-being of the individuals who wield it. As we move through the long history of inbreeding among royal families, it's evident that these genetic consequences have not only shaped the lives of monarchs, but also left lasting impacts on entire nations and political systems. Royal families, once considered the unshakable pillars of Europe's aristocracy, have often fallen victim to the very practices that were meant to keep them strong and unified. The obsession with maintaining a pure bloodline led to dynastic declines that reverberated through history, from the fall of the Habsburgs in Spain to the tragic demise of the Romanovs in Russia. As we continue our journey, it's crucial to examine another example of a royal family whose inbreeding ultimately proved to be their undoing: the Spanish Habsburgs, the Habsburg dynasty. Perhaps more than any other royal family, exemplifies the devastating effects of centuries of intermarriage. This family ruled much of Europe, including Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, for hundreds of years, becoming one of the most powerful and influential families in history. Yet, by the time of Charles II's reign, the Habsburgs were facing a dramatic genetic collapse. The family's decision to marry cousins and close relatives, generation after generation, was not only an attempt to consolidate power, but also a critical factor in the physical and mental decline of the Habsburg line. Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, is one of history's most tragic figures. Born with a severe genetic burden, he suffered from numerous physical and mental impairments, some of which were visible from birth. Charles had the characteristic Habsburg jaw, a prominent feature of the family, but his deformities extended far beyond his appearance. He was mentally and physically weak, struggling with learning disabilities, mobility issues, and poor health. His condition, while tragic on a personal level, was also a symbol of the larger problem facing the Habsburg dynasty: the consequences of generations of inbreeding. Historians still debate whether Charles II's condition was solely the result of inbreeding, or whether other factors, such as environmental conditions or the stress of royal life, contributed to his problems. However, there's little doubt that the repeated cousin marriages within the Habsburg family played a significant role in the physical and mental decline of Charles and his predecessors. The family's obsession with preserving power through blood purity eventually led to a bottleneck in the gene pool, which made the Habsburgs increasingly vulnerable to genetic disorders. The most devastating consequence of Charles II's genetic issues was his inability to produce an heir. As we've seen time and time again throughout the history of royal inbreeding, the failure to produce healthy heirs is often the death knell for a dynasty. Charles II's inability to have children marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. When Charles died in 1700, Spain was left with no clear successor, which led to the War of Spanish Succession, a major conflict that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. The Habsburgs were replaced by the Bourbon family, whose bloodline, despite its own inbreeding issues, was not as severely affected as the Habsburgs. The War of Spanish Succession, fought between European powers for control of the Spanish throne, serves as a perfect example of how inbreeding can influence the political landscape. The war's outcome, which saw the Bourbons take control of Spain, was directly linked to the genetic decline of the Habsburgs. Charles II's failure to produce a successor made Spain vulnerable to external threats, and the Bourbon family's rise to power marked a dramatic shift in European politics. The consequences of the Habsburgs' inbreeding, which had long been a taboo subject, finally became apparent on the world stage, leading to the fall of one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. The rise of the Bourbons in Spain was not just a political shift, it was a symbol of how the practice of royal inbreeding could lead to the weakening of entire empires. The transition from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons, though peaceful, marked the beginning of a new era for Spain. The Bourbons, despite their own history of inbreeding, managed to avoid the severe genetic issues that had plagued the Habsburgs. Their ability to marry outside the family, at least to a greater extent than the Habsburgs, allowed them to establish a more stable and healthy bloodline, and they ruled Spain for several centuries. However, the example of the Spanish Habsburgs serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of inbreeding, not just for individual monarchs, but for entire empires. The collapse of the Habsburgs demonstrates how the pursuit of bloodline purity can ultimately lead to a family's downfall. The Habsburgs, for all their wealth and power, were ultimately undone by their own obsessive attempts to preserve their bloodline. And when that bloodline failed, so too did their empire. Moving beyond the Habsburgs and the Romanovs, we begin to see a broader trend in European history: the decline of monarchies as a result of the genetic consequences of inbreeding. Throughout the centuries, many royal families struggled with the challenge of maintaining power and influence through strategic marriages. The political marriages that once served as the foundation of royal alliances often led to unintended consequences. The genetic issues that arose from repeated inbreeding weakened royal families from within. In the case of the Habsburgs, the damage was irreparable. Charles II's death without an heir sealed the fate of the family, and the transition to the Bourbons in Spain marked the end of an era. But even after the Habsburgs were replaced by the Bourbons, the practice of royal inbreeding continued, though it would become increasingly taboo as the centuries wore on. Over time, European monarchies began to shift away from inbreeding, particularly as the practice became recognized for its destructive consequences. The rise of more modern forms of royal marriages, ones that considered the health of future generations, marked the beginning of the end for the widespread practice of cousin marriages within royal families. The decline of the Habsburgs and the Romanovs, along with the weakening of other dynasties due to inbreeding, contributed to a broader shift in European politics. As monarchies crumbled and revolutions took hold, the influence of royal families began to wane. The political instability created by inbreeding, combined with the rise of new political movements, eventually led to the fall of many once families. However, the story of royal inbreeding is not one solely of failure. The Bourbons, who took control after the fall of the Habsburgs, survived for centuries and adapted to changing times. And while the impact of inbreeding was undeniable, it also prompted political reform and the gradual decline of hereditary monarchies in Europe. The transition from royal power to parliamentary rule, the rise of constitutional monarchies, and the eventual democratization of European nations were all part of the shifting landscape in which these dynasties operated. In conclusion, the legacy of royal inbreeding is one of tragedy and transformation. From the Habsburgs to the Romanovs, royal families who once held unimaginable power were ultimately undone by the very practices they believed would protect them. These stories remind us of the fragility of dynastic power and the long-term consequences of prioritizing bloodlines over the health and well-being of individuals. The fall of the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and other dynasties shaped the course of European history and served as a powerful reminder that even the most powerful royal families can be undone by the genetic consequences of their own decisions. As we conclude this exploration into the consequences of royal inbreeding, it's important to reflect on how this practice, despite its seemingly logical rationale of maintaining power and bloodlines, ultimately led to the unraveling of some of the most influential dynasties in history. Royal families, once thought to be invincible due to their vast empires, were often unceremoniously toppled by the genetic and political fallout of their obsession with purity of blood. In the case of the Habsburgs, we have already seen how their decline, exacerbated by generations of cousin marriages, resulted in a genetic bottleneck that led to physical and mental disabilities within the family. The ultimate failure of Charles II to produce a viable heir marked the collapse of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and the rise of the Bourbon family. But what makes the story of inbreeding even more tragic is the recognition that this practice was not limited to just the Habsburgs. It spread throughout the royal courts of Europe with similar consequences, though the results varied depending on how deeply the practice of intermarriage was ingrained in each family's politics. One cannot discuss inbreeding in royal families without examining the fate of the British monarchy and the lasting consequences of Queen Victoria's legacy. As we've previously discussed, Queen Victoria's marriage to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, set in motion a series of genetic issues within her family that would stretch across Europe. The most infamous of these issues was the inheritance of haemophilia, which spread from the British royal family to many other European royal families. This royal disease claimed the lives of several young princes, most notably the tragic case of Tsarevich Alexei Romanov. The genetic disorder had far-reaching effects, not only on the health of the royal family, but also on its public image. The British monarchy, which had once been a symbol of stability and strength, became increasingly seen as weak and out of touch with the people. The growing knowledge of haemophilia within the royal family, coupled with public perception of the monarch's failure to produce healthy heirs, added to the pressure facing Queen Victoria's descendants. By the time of the First World War, the royal family found itself in the midst of a generational shift in which the question of the monarchy's future was uncertain. Even more so than with the Habsburgs, the consequences of inbreeding in the British royal family contributed to the royal family's diminishing influence. The monarchy had to evolve significantly in the 20th century, with public opinion, World War I, and political pressures challenging the idea of hereditary monarchy. The intermarriage that had once been seen as an essential tool for preserving royal power became increasingly irrelevant in a modernizing world. The monarchy had to adapt to a new era, one in which the royal bloodline was no longer as crucial to national identity and governance. In this new world, Queen Victoria's genetic legacy loomed large, especially given that the royal disease had affected several European royal families, not just the British monarchy. This web of interconnected royal bloodlines, which had once been a source of political power, now served as a reminder of the fragility of royal authority. When monarchies were replaced by republics and the old world order crumbled, the royal family's inbred bloodlines, once thought to confer strength and purity, became a symbol of genetic decay and political instability. And yet, while inbreeding undoubtedly weakened many of Europe's royal houses, there are also instances where the decline wasn't so directly connected to genetic inheritance. Some royal families experienced political instability due to external pressures, such as war, economic collapse, or revolutionary movements, which also played crucial roles in their decline. In many ways, the question of whether inbreeding alone led to their downfall is an oversimplification of a much more complex political landscape. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Valois, and the Plantagenets all faced multiple factors that contributed to their demise. The reality is that while inbreeding led to genetic weakness within royal families, it was often the political and social context surrounding these dynasties that hastened their fall from power. For example, the Romanovs' downfall was not solely due to the genetic issues stemming from their bloodline. The Russian Revolution was driven by mass dissatisfaction with autocratic rule, the exacerbation of social inequalities, and the trauma of World War I. Similarly, the Habsburgs' inability to produce a healthy heir was compounded by the economic and political challenges of maintaining their vast empire in the face of growing nationalist movements and external conflicts. Even with these external pressures, inbreeding was undoubtedly an accelerant for the decline of many of these royal families. The failure to produce healthy heirs, coupled with the genetic instability that arose from generations of intermarriage, created an environment ripe for political unrest. The personal struggles of monarchs, whether it was Charles II's inability to rule Serena Alexandra's emotional isolation, or the mental instability of Charles VI, often mirrored by the larger political instability of their countries. As we move beyond the historical examples, we begin to see the broader implications of royal inbreeding for the future of dynasties and nations. The rise of democratic movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the decline of monarchies, forced royal families to adapt to changing times. The genetic consequences of inbreeding that plagued so many royal houses were compounded by the shift in public opinion, which increasingly rejected the notion of hereditary rule. The political instability caused by inbreeding was mirrored by the collapse of many monarchies. As people began to question the legitimacy of dynastic rule and to demand more democratic forms of governance, today, the legacy of royal inbreeding is largely seen as a cautionary tale. Royal families, particularly in Europe, are no longer the central powerhouses they once were. While many still hold symbolic power, their political authority has diminished significantly. The decline of monarchies is a reflection of the changing nature of power itself, moving from hereditary rule to more inclusive forms of governance. The tragic history of inbreeding within royal families serves as a reminder of the dangers of trying to preserve power through bloodlines. Ultimately, the strength of a dynasty cannot be sustained by genetics alone. The history of inbreeding in royal families is not simply about genetic consequences. It's also about the politics of power, the obsession with maintaining power within a family, even at the cost of the health and well-being of the individuals within it, ultimately led to the decline of once powerful dynasties. The downfall of the Habsburgs, Romanovs, and other royal families demonstrates that power, when based solely on bloodlines, is fragile. The future of nations and monarchies lies not in the purity of their bloodlines, but in their ability to adapt to changing times and to be responsive to the needs of their people.